Were you carrying nuclear bombs?
Major, as you know, I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons aboard an airplane.
I know that, but I really have to know.
I know that, but I'm not allowed to tell you.
All right, let me put it another way. I'm sending out rescue parties. I need to know how close they can safely approach the crash site.
Major, I wouldn't go in 3,000 feet of that son of a bitch.
That tells me all that I need to know.
Well, welcome to The Rest is Classified. I'm David McCloskey.
And I'm Gordon Carrera.
And that, for those who couldn't tell, was B-52 co-pilot Joe DiMario talking to the base commander at Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. So we left Joe DiMario in his parachute, actually, fleeing and this is going to sound insane, but it's true, fleeing a burning B-52 bomber carrying 4 thermonuclear weapons over Greenland in 1968. And we left Joe. He was falling out of that plane. He had a parachute open. The plane is burning. There's nuclear bombs aboard. And he is going to land on Greenland, Gordon. And we are telling, in this kind of two-parter on The Rest is Classified, we are telling the secret history of the largest island in the world and future site of my second home once the United States purchases it. I'm very much looking forward to my new life on Greenland, but we are telling a kind of dark underbelly of Greenland's history and its connection to the world of espionage and secret military sites.
That's right. And this crash in 1968 is a vital part of that history and understanding, really, Greenland's importance. Because as we said, part of the reason these nuclear bombers were flying there is because of this radar station, which they're monitoring in case the Soviets take it out as a prelude to a first strike on the United States. And the nuclear bombers are there ready for a go-co to kind of carry out their own attack on the Soviet Union. But after the fire, Joe DiMario and the others have bailed out of the bomber. Joe swings wildly in the air as he's ejected by his ejector seat from the B-52. He's looking down. He's right over the air base, this crucial air base at Thule. Still there, of course, is still very important. He's drifting down. He's hoping to hit soft snow, but instead he slams into hard ice and rolls over onto his back. He tries to release his parachute, but his fingers are so cold, despite the fact he's wearing gloves, that his fingers won't kind of work properly to release the parachute. So he has to use the flat of his hands to kind of smash the latch and release himself. Walks towards the hangar at the airbase. One of the doors slowly opens. These are big 60 feet high steel doors. I mean, he thinks they've spotted him, but it's actually because a truck is coming into the hangar. And then he's taken to the base operations where he has that conversation with the commander that we had at the start. So Joe's made it. The rest of the crew, I mean, 6 of the 7 make it down. One, it takes 20 hours to rescue him from the ice, and he's got pretty bad frostbite.
We should say it's January, right? I mean, it's January of 1968, so it is completely dark on Greenland and just absolutely bitterly cold while these guys are out there.
The sun does not rise.
Period.
It doesn't rise at this point at all. And as we heard last time, the B-52 is unattended and flying, and then Joe has seen and heard and felt this blast hitting the base. And the flash alert is sent to US Air Force with the code name Broken Arrow, which means an accident involving nuclear weapons. It's a Sunday afternoon in Omaha, Nebraska.
Beautiful town.
Beautiful town, home of Strategic Air Command. Major General Hunziker, who is just finishing his lunch, 3 p.m. local time.
It's a late lunch.
Quite a late lunch.
It's a late lunch.
Sunday, but also general. And he gets the call about this crash. And within about 4 or 5 hours, he and a kind of disaster response team are going to be out on a KC-135 heading to Greenland. So they are prepped, ready for this kind of accident and ready to go out there and respond.
And that is the start of a mission that is codenamed Crested Ice, which is going to actually end up running for much of 1968. And it is yet another, if you listen to the prior episode on the secret history of Greenland, this is one of many wonderful Arctic code names that just sort of layer this whole story. I think it's not the best one that we've talked about.
Iceworm
is probably the best. Crested Ice, though, not bad. Give it a solid C. And I guess when they arrive, it's totally dark. It's so cold that their flashlights will actually go dead in about 15 minutes when they're out searching. And the average temperature, just to set this up, is minus 40. Is that right, Gordon? Or is that a misprint here in the notes? One day it's minus 110. So sort of apocalyptic cold. Yeah.
It's like Texas is at the moment.
Well, right. And yeah, for those watching, I am still in my winter jacket. The temperature has been dropping actually precipitously outside as we've been recording. And it's falling in my little recording studio as well. So it is very cold in here. So I'm fully in character for this rescue mission.
For Crested Ice.
Crested Ice.
I mean, interestingly enough, when they were doing this rescue mission, because Arctic storms could suddenly kind of descend on the base, so the local Inuits, the local population, actually built igloos for the US military to shelter in. I mean, I just love this idea that you've got the US military, the most advanced in the world, looking for a kind of nuclear weapons and doing a kind of recovery of a crash and having to use locally built igloos to shelter in. It's an interesting insight into how actually the local customs are actually pretty important because they've got no other way of surviving than relying on them in a way.
There was no tauntaun to slit open and tuck yourself into for warmth. Isn't that right, Gordon?
That's another Star Wars reference for those, including Becki, one of our producers, who hasn't seen Star Wars, which is a bit of a miss. Anyway, that's another story. So this is Crested Ice. This is the search mission. You know, they initially take a helicopter out to look for the wreckage. And what's interesting is they can't see any wreckage from the plane. So at first they think the whole aircraft might have kind of gone through the ice. But actually it's broken up with debris all around. And the debris almost instantly been covered by snowstorms.
I do have a question at this point, Gordon, which is, this sounds insensitive, but obviously it's very important to try to rescue the crew. But what has happened to the 4 thermonuclear weapons that were aboard the B-52? I mean, that seems...
That seems kind of important.
Where did those things go?
Yeah. So what had happened is the aircraft had actually started to shed its skin because it's coming in low at 525 knots. The outer frame literally peels off. And then it's coming in quite shallow and it hits 3-foot thick ice on the bay at a shallow angle of around 20 degrees. This is about 8 miles out on a bay from the base. It's a heavy plane weighing about 410,000 pounds. And because it hits the shallow angle, 3/4 of the momentum is forwards rather than downwards. So the plane just kind of splatters along the ice, breaking up. You know, the engines are found 2 miles south of the impact point as the velocity just kind of carries them on. Packed full of jet fuel, because as we heard last time, it had just done a refuel, as well as the weapons. And so what happens is the high explosives of the nuclear bombs actually detonates as they're crushed.
What are the high explosives? I do like a good explanation of, nuclear weaponry, Gordon.
I'll do my best. So there's a primary and the secondary. The primary is designed to trigger the secondary, which is the main charge, if you like. And this is important in this context because what's happened is that the primary is largely, but not exclusively, high explosives and some plutonium, which goes round the fissile core of the bomb, which is the big bomb. And what's happened is the main bomb is not armed, but the high explosives have detonated around the bomb without actually triggering the nuclear chain reaction inside it. Now, if the bombs had been armed and they could have gone off by the high explosives going off, then frankly, that could have started World War III because the US might have seen a nuclear detonation at the base and assumed the Soviets had struck the base and, it's the start of World War III. So it could have been much worse.
And it probably is worth saying that radar that we talked about in the last episode, which can see incoming missiles over the North Pole, can see things that are the size of maybe a tennis ball 3,000 miles away as they're moving at incredible velocities. And the radar that wreaked havoc on Gordon Carrera's pacemaker during his visit when he toured the base.
Non-existent pacemaker.
That radar is kind of, I think it's just Brad was mentioning, one of the through lines to today, because that station is still there. And it is an absolutely critical piece of monitoring the Soviet military, the missile force, space. And so this essentially a massive accident like this above, and around sort of that radar station and military base, it has, an incredible effect, I think, on the psychology.
Now, in terms of what happened, to the bombs, the Pentagon officially says all 4 bombs were destroyed. Now, that is true technically because the high explosives have detonated and the primaries have been destroyed. But, this is the reason I went there in 2008, was to kind of investigate what had happened to this. We'd looked at some declassified documents. Now, this is we should say, disputed because a lot of the documents are still classified. But what seems to have happened, if you piece it together from the documents and accounts at the time, is that they can then find in that search, in Crested Ice, 3 of the 4 secondary nuclear devices. So that is the kind of fissile core of the bomb. They find those 3 pretty quickly, but the problem is the 4th.
3 out of 4 ain't bad, though, right? I mean,
yeah, it's a slight problem. By March, they realised that they're missing some parts of the bomb. And the theory is that some of it went under the ice because most of the kind of fuel and debris creates a kind of blackened crust along the ice. But at one point of impact, the ice is shattered in about a 15-metre wide circle and almost instantly freezes over again. But it's pretty clear that some stuff has gone through that hole in the ice. The water's pretty shallow. So actually, at this point, the US sends in a sub to look on the seabed about 600 feet down to see if they can find these missing components.
And this sub, looking at, just the picture of it, I don't know. My first thought, Gordon, was it looks like something you'd take for like a 3-hour tour. It looks like something out of Gilligan's Island, this thing that they put underneath the water. But I guess it's got this interesting claw attached to it. And it's going to spend a lot of time up there, isn't it, looking around for this thing?
It looks like something from Thunderbirds, I think it's been described, because it looks like a kind of toy sub, but it is a real sub.
No, it very much looks like a child's bathtub toy. Yeah.
It does. But they send it down, and it's quite clear that they are not finding everything. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that when we did the story back 2008, 2009, became a bit of a thing with Denmark. It doesn't look like there was a whole bomb down there. And when we did our story, the Danish government then commissioned a report to respond to our story, to look into it, basically. And their report basically says there was no missing bomb. And I'm going to slightly take this opportunity to push back because they set up a straw man, which was our story was headlined The Lost Bomb. And as we know, a good title counts. And the report that was commissioned basically goes, no bomb was lost. There was no lost bomb. But if you actually read the kind of full story rather than just the headline, you can see that we're talking about parts of a bomb and not the whole thing, because we make clear that, it broke apart when it hit the ice. And actually, when you read the whole of this Danish report, what it confirms is that part of the fissile core of one of the weapons does look to have been abandoned under the ice. Now, they call it the Marshall's baton.
Baton.
Baton, thank you.
For our American listeners.
Because it's about the kind of shape and size of a baton. But, the report itself says that it's the fissile core of the thermonuclear secondary stage of the weapon, probably containing about 8 kilograms of uranium-235. So I would still suggest that's kind of significant if that is abandoned beneath the ice and left behind, even if it's not a whole bomb.
You remember the Clancy novel, Sum of All Fears, where there's a missing nuclear weapon? It goes missing after the 6-Day War. I believe the Israelis lose it, and then pieces of it are recovered, and then eventually, I believe, used in the United States. Was that a possibility, I guess? Someone would have to get to it, of course, but was there sufficient material there that you could have actually, if someone had come into possession of it, they would have been able to turn it into a weapon?
Well, it is interesting because, I remember at the time talking to a kind of US weapons designer who'd worked on the recovery, and they said that classified pieces of the weapon were not recovered. But, as they put it, they figured the US couldn't get it, but nor could anyone else because of where it had gone and where it was basically in the most remote place on Earth you could imagine. If the US couldn't get it for months with its sub, I think the theory is anyone else who's looking for those classified components wouldn't be able to find it quickly or without them noticing at the nearby base. So I guess the decision is taken, we're just going to have to leave it there and the risk is relatively low. So something was certainly left behind.
There's a bunch of enriched uranium leaching into the ice then, right?
Yeah, which you would think is a bit of a problem. Even this Danish report that was, commissioned says we cannot provide a final material balance on the nuclear material in the bomb. In other words, they acknowledge that they don't know what happened to all of that uranium and plutonium. And one of the problems is the amount of nuclear material in the bombs is actually classified, because that's a kind of secret, which is how much you need to make a bomb. So for that reason, it was never clear how much there was, and the US has never said. But one of the controversies, which has a legacy right through today, is the effects for those involved in the cleanup and in the region, because Danish workers as well were involved in collecting some of the debris from the crash. And it's clear some of the plutonium was on the ice, was in the debris, had moved into the environment. and 500,000 gallons of ice is actually shipped back to the US.
They're afraid it's contaminated.
They're afraid it's contaminated. And some of the Danes involved would fall ill, and I interviewed one who'd, raced to help, and a group of them took a case to the European Court to say, that they'd fallen ill because of their role in this crash. But the problem is, it's almost impossible years later to definitively prove a link between the ill health that they certainly experienced and the crash. To actually prove it becomes very hard for them in their case. And I also visited the town of Kanak, which is the Inuit town, which is about 60 to 90 miles up the coast. And there, some of the people also say they felt ill health. And one of the hunters who I went out with, said he would, for years afterwards, find seals with their innards kind of almost cooked as if by radiation, and with weird deformities amongst the seals. And so they were, convinced that there was a legacy of some of that nuclear material having entered the ecosystem. The scientists have said there's nothing to worry about, and, the plutonium would have been diluted in such a large body of water. But there's certainly a feeling amongst locals, Danes who'd been involved in the clear up, and some of those local Inuit residents, that there's been a cover-up about the ill health effects and the legacy from that crash.
I guess it begs the question. The dialogue we read up front suggests that, of course, no one was supposed to know that there were nuclear weapons aboard that plane. But, did the Danes know right off the bat that there was a missing, nuclear bomb? The U.S. tried to keep that secret from Denmark as well.
Here's the big problem, and this, I think, starts to take us to the present, some of the kind of tensions over Greenland, because it was a big deal, because Denmark had explicitly had a policy at the time of being a nuclear-free zone. And Greenland is part of Denmark. It had once been a colony, but from 1953, it's effectively a kind of county of Denmark. And it's supposed to be nuclear free. And so, within hours of the crash, the Danish foreign minister says there are no nuclear weapons in Greenland. The American authorities are aware of Denmark's nuclear policy, and the Danish government, assumes there are no nuclear overflights of Greenland carrying nuclear weapons. And so the Danes are saying publicly that there's no nuclear weapons and that's not possible. And of course, there are. And this starts to cause some of the problems. But the US is particularly annoyed by this because they actually had a secret deal with the Danish government in 1957 saying that they could store nuclear weapons in Greenland. But this was secret, and the Danes had basically not told their own public, who were kind of pretty cautious and anti-nuclear and worried about upsetting the Soviet Union. So, this is very, very awkward for the Danish government, the fact that there has been a crash, and you cannot hide the fact that there's been a crash involving nuclear weapons when Greenland is supposed to be part of this nuclear-free zone. And
it really seemed like it took a long time for that truth to come out, because there were bombs situated for, months at a time at Thule in the 50s and in the 60s, a significant number for the Nike Hercules, kind of surface-to-air missiles that were based there. I like how, Gordon, we've approached sort of a Trumpian anti-Dane piece here, but the Danes were covering this up, weren't they? It was essentially a forward operating base for our sort of nuclear deterrent for much of the Cold War, and they didn't tell their people about it, which I guess makes some sense.
Again, I don't want to sound too Trumpian about it myself, but I think there was this idea where the Danes were leaning on the kind of NATO nuclear umbrella to protect them. But we're saying, but we're nuclear free and, we don't want any of these nasty nuclear weapons. And that's their public stance. But privately, from this 1957 deal, the Prime Minister said, yeah, you can base some nuclear weapons in Greenland if you need to, but just we're not going to tell anybody. So they're basically misleading their own public. And that only comes out in 1995, finally, that there has been this secret deal by the Danes to allow the US to store these weapons. So it takes many decades and is a kind of source of tension, I think, between the US and Denmark and Greenland about the fact there's been, let's say, a bit of misleading, if one were to, be honest, a little bit of covering up about what had really happened in terms of the role that Greenland was playing in the Cold War as this kind of nuclear base, effectively, at certain points.
Well, we love a good cover-up on The Rest is Classified, don't we? So maybe there, Gordon, let's take a break. And when we come back, we will bring this story up to the present and talk about what missing nuclear bombs and this incredibly strategic base mean for Greenland now and for the art of the deal. Well, welcome back. We are talking now about the legacy of this horrific broken arrow incident, a lost nuclear weapon in Greenland. I mean, part of the legacy of the crash, Gordon, is that it says something about this complex relationship between Denmark and the US and Greenland even today.
Yeah, that's right. I think the crash exposed the reality of the relationship, the way the US used it as a military base, the way the Danes had known about it and to some extent covered up some of the things that had happened, and the way in which some people in Greenland, I think, felt that they were being exploited. And what you've seen since then, I think it's one of the factors which has led to a greater drive for independence from Greenlanders, from that local population. I mean, at that time of the crash, it was technically a Danish county, so part of Denmark itself. 1979, it gets home rule. Later, Greenland becomes self-governing. Now, the Danes certainly want to see themselves as a kind of benevolent overlords over Greenland, but stories have come out which I think have fueled that desire for independence. I mean, there's a pretty horrific story about a large-scale contraceptive campaign in which, devices were fitted into women of childbearing age, sometimes without their consent, on the island in the 1960s.
Jeez.
Of children being taken away from their parents. This is all history from that time. But I think it has fueled the idea amongst Greenlanders that they have been treated as a kind of colony in some ways. It's kind of dark colonial stuff. But also they have been reliant economically on Denmark. There's a block grant of about £500 million a year for economic help. And in return, they get access to a kind of Danish welfare and health system. But that sense of the relationship fracturing, I think, has been growing. And opinion polls are showing that about 2/3 of Greenlanders want independence from Denmark. And that seems to be the pretty strong direction of travel. Now, it's true, they may not want the Danes, but it doesn't necessarily they want to trade one colonial overlord for another, in this case, the United States. That's one of the tensions here, is that they want independence rather than necessarily just independence from Denmark and to be in US hands. But I think the drive towards independence is one of the things which is also making the US, I think, nervous about the future of Greenland.
There's a great line during the first Trump campaign that said, sometimes when you hear what he says, he's not to be taken literally, but oftentimes needs to be taken seriously. I think the Greenland rhetoric is sort of classic Trumpian, right? I mean, number one, it's helpful for him, I think, to be seen fighting with European prime ministers. That's good politics for him. But you kind of scratch the surface of it and you see that, well, I mean, much of the story we've just talked about sheds light on these dynamics, that if Greenland becomes independent, what happens to essentially the military sovereignty that the US exerts over the island today? What happens with respect to the mineral rights on Greenland? And one of the things we alluded to this, I think, briefly in the first episode, but it's possible that Greenland contains a very significant percentage of the world's kind of rare earth minerals, including a lot of the inputs for things like batteries and electric vehicles. And these minerals are deeply embedded into sort of military supply chains. There's even some estimates that Greenland might contain up to a quarter of many of the rare earths on the planet. And that rare earth issue is much more complicated than just where are they. It's an issue around refining and production capacity and all of that. So I don't mean to gloss that over, but I think there is this sense that Donald Trump is hitting on a very real fear, maybe, that this gigantic piece of land in an increasingly strategic part of the world could fall out of the US's sphere of influence potentially down the line.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's worth saying that there is a competition for control of these critical minerals, these rare earths, with China in particular. And I think the fear is that China, and to some extent Russia, could increase their influence over Greenland, particularly as it moves towards more independence and, requires economic investment. The danger is for the US that it turns to China and to some extent Russia for that economic support.
Well, and right now, this delicate dance, I guess, between, the US and Denmark and Greenland, I mean, it plays out in very practical ways with respect to Chinese influence, because China has tried to buy a rare earth mining site in Greenland. They tried to underwrite the construction of airports, buy an abandoned naval base in Greenland. And the way the United States was able to block those attempts to sort of build up its influence inside Greenland was to go and pressure the Danish government, to pressure Greenland to reject the Chinese offers. And so I think there would be this real concern that maybe not in the next 6 months, but 5-10 years down the road, if Greenland's independent, is the United States able to use that kind of same lever, push the Danes to then push the Greenlanders? And with Denmark out of the picture, I think that question mark gets bigger.
Yeah, that's right. And all of this is happening as the Arctic returns to being a kind of key theatre for competition and kind of great power competition. We talked about how in the early Cold War, they realized how important it was, but it's getting more important again. And that's particularly due to climate change. And I think the impact of climate change on national security is really underappreciated. And the importance of Greenland is a really good example of that, because it is the idea that the melting ice is creating new shipping lanes, new sea lanes, new places in which competition is going to be played out. And the Russians are busy. I mean, they are building up bases in the Arctic. You know, they have this huge kind of stretch of land which is up against the Arctic, and they are busy building bases and moving their ships up there. And the Chinese have also been busy building icebreakers and sailing them up through the Arctic and becoming more involved there, even though they're not classically an Arctic power. So there is this sense that the Arctic is becoming more important, and therefore Greenland and its strategic position is also going to become even more important in the future.
And the Chinese call it the Polar Silk Road, Gordon, which is a great word as well. The shipping point is fascinating because it is so, relatively speaking, new. The sort of season of ice-free travel in the Northwest Passage that links the Atlantic and the Pacific runs from July to September, but before 2007, it wasn't open. So not even 20 years ago, you didn't have this shipping lane. And between, really in the last decade, Arctic shipping kind of in total is up like 40%, right? So these kind of lanes for commerce, potential lanes of approach from a military standpoint are more and more open. And again, I think our concept, so many of us, we talked about this in the previous episode, so many of us have this concept of the Arctic as being sort of distant from us, or when you spread a flat map out and you look at it, you think, well, we're not actually that close to the Russians or the Chinese. But the reality is all of those Russian bases that kind of ring its Arctic region, and they have significantly more than we do. I think we have 5 bases on Alaska, just one, Putufik, formerly Thule, on Greenland. The Russians have many more. We should probably think about those bases as really bordering us, in many respects. Whereas if you just kind of pin them on a flat map, you would think they're very distant from us, but they're actually very close because it's a globe, right? It's a sphere. And that is where that positioning of Greenland matters so much. I mean, even the kind of, wild Trumpy quote I read at the beginning of the prior episode where he's talking about Chinese ships and Russian ships. I mean, those sea lanes are the real deal. If Russia wanted to send crude to China by boat, it used to take a month because they would have to go through the Suez. And now if they send them on those Arctic lanes, it takes 2 weeks. It's a very real impact on shipping costs, on commerce, and on the projection of military force.
And the militaries are certainly busier up there as well as it becomes more important. You've had Russian planes flying over the Arctic. I mean, you've got more submarine activity and that Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which we mentioned last time, this kind of choke point, it was there for kind of German U-boats in the Second World War. And it's important for submarines now, for Russian submarines, which might be heading towards the Atlantic. That's often one of the routes that they might go by. So all of this, I think, suggests that Greenland's military and strategic importance has not diminished. If anything, it's growing. And it's got that radar there on top of the world, scanning for missile launches and also out into space, which is also a kind of a key battleground increasingly for militaries to operate in and for great power competition. And that radar station is vital. So for all these reasons, I guess what we're saying is there is a reason behind the talk about Greenland. It's not as kind of obscure as people might think when they first heard it. Why would anyone want this kind of big ice sheet? Or why would Donald Trump be talking about it? There are actually national security reasons why the US might be interested in having or maintaining or increasing control of it in some way, even if buying it in a Trumpy way is not necessarily the most diplomatic way of talking to the Danes or the Greenlanders or others about it.
Or maybe, Gordon, there could also be spiritual reasons for purchasing it, right?
Spiritual reasons.
Spiritual reasons for purchasing it. Well, this is where this is disconnected somewhat from the national security conversation. But there is a cluster of people in kind of Trump world, I guess you could say, conservatives in the States, who would look at Greenland as a new frontier, potentially, right? We Americans love a good frontier. We like that frontier to sort of remain open for a while so we can send people out to help close it. And I think it does seem like there's some sense of, I don't think this is necessarily why Trump is making these pronouncements. I think it is more connected to the kind of military strategic issues we've been talking about. But there is a sub-segment of this story that's also kind of wacky in the sense of wanting to have an open frontier to sort of revive this kind of pioneering spirit, I would say.
Yeah, the kind of 19th century spirit of a kind of expanding America. I mean, that's something which I think Donald Trump kind of harkens back a little bit to, whether it's Panama or Greenland. But also, as you said, I think there's some of the kind of tech bros around him who've had this idea about, creating offshore colonies, about, kind of new beginnings. There's an ideology of expansion and frontiersism, if that's a word, which I think Greenland kind of captures somehow. That there is that kind of strata to it as well, of the thinking and the reasons why people are kind of captivated by that. But there is also a little bit of it which does feel a bit 19th century imperial. Dare I say it, as a country which threw off its colonial overlords in the 18th century, now seems to be keen to take on its own kind of colonial possessions, or at least absorb them into the nation.
Well, it would be the first expansion of territory for the United States since the McKinley administration annexed Hawaii. Hawaii was annexed territory, becomes a state, but this would be the first actual new piece of absorbed territory. Were Trump able to do this deal, which seems unlikely. I say that to, I think, just say that you're right, and it kind of harkens back to, or it seems to harken back to this earlier era of kind of more raw kind of colonialism. It is interesting, though, when you think about, I'm not going to side with the tech bros necessarily here, but it is a piece of territory that has 50,000+ inhabitants. And if you placed Greenland over the continental US, it would stretch from the southern tip of Texas to north of the Canadian border. So you can kind of see how it excites a piece of the imagination around an unsettled piece of land that is potentially going to be more habitable, more important in the future. So it's all that to say that it's this Trumpian show of strength, and always good to have a fight with, a European prime minister over something. But below the surface, Greenland actually, for those listening in, the UK and in the US, I mean, it matters to our kind of collective security. It really does.
So hopefully what we've showed over these episodes is just how Greenland is more than just a kind of rhetorical flourish for the Trump administration, but actually there is some kind of hard-edged security behind it as the Arctic opens up. And the secret history, I think, of Greenland, the secret bases, Project Iceworm, the Broken Arrow incident, all tell you that this is actually a place that matters a lot more than you might think it does. So with that, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Now, I've got a question for you listeners. Do you want your brand to be the next NordVPN?
Now, David, you know that I love NordVPN.
I do know this.
And I love the support that they have been showing the show. But I'm certain some of our listeners have been listening to other adverts on The Rest is Classified, and they've thought my brand would fit here.
Well, we can make that happen. You can have your brand right here on The Rest is Classified and other shows right across the Goalhanger network. Say goodbye to random ads and say hello to your brand and a whole bunch of lovey-feely caring listeners.
So it is worth explaining who Goalhanger are. They are the production company, the maestros behind The Rest is Classified, along with The rest is history. The rest is politics, empire, and a whole host of other shows. Now, if you want to get your brand out there, they're the people to talk to, and they want to hear from you.
They do, and that's why they're throwing a gathering in March in Holborn, London for anyone who would like to advertise with us. Various Goal Hanger hosts will be giving talks, and it's your chance to meet the people who can get your brand across the Goal Hanger network.
I'll be there, and if you want to learn more about the Goal Hanger network, you can go to their brand new website, www.goalhanger.com. That's Goal Hanger, HANGER.com, to read more. And whilst you're there, you can register your interest for the March event. So I'll see you there.